I'm tempted to begin this lesson tonight by asking for a show of hands who has their CCP. That's concealed carry permit for those that don't have one. But this is something that, with all the escalating violence, it seems, in the world today, I think this is a fair question to ask, especially from the Christian, because we're supposed to appraise things spiritually. And so what the world raises as one standard of morality isn't necessarily the right standard of morality for the Christian. So we have to weigh everything against the Word of God and try to look at everything from a spiritual perspective. And so this is a question, like I said, that is fair to ask. Now, a lot of, this discussion is prefaced on, simple, straightforward statements in the Bible that says, "Thou shalt not kill." And so that's really kind of at the question is self-defense, but I'm going to emphasize the idea of lethal force. Is the Christian authorized? Does God allow us to use lethal force as far as self-defense is concerned? And there's all kinds of hypotheticals. There's all kinds of back and forth on these arguments. This is one that in the New Testament, it doesn't, really come out word for word and tell us exactly about home defense. There's some good scriptures that deal with this directly in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we're given some principles and we have to weigh them. This is one of those questions that ultimately, I'll give you something to think about, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. This is going to be something that in those situations where we encounter violence, when we encounter malice or evil towards ourselves or our family or loved ones, it's one thing to say what we would do, but I suspect that in the heat of the moment, with our adrenaline rushing or whatever going on physiologically, I suspect that whatever happens is going to happen, and it's going to be up to us and our conscience to sort out that mess later. So that being said, on this idea of thou shalt not kill, we need to understand that just in basic terms, we can't make this an ironclad rule that applies to every scenario, because we understand that there are certain realms where that is acceptable. I don't think we would criticize police. In fact, many Christians would applaud what police do in protecting others. Sometimes in their line of duty it involves taking a life. And for my part, I would have a hard time condemning that. If it was in the line of work and it was something that was deemed a necessary violence to protect others. And if God is no respecter of persons, I have a hard time wondering, could we be okay with the police doing that in his line of work, using violence to defend others or force to defend others, yet we would condemn others who are not police officers? And so it's just hard to, make a blanket rule, because there are some acceptable realms. We give governments, that leeway because God gives them that leeway. God gives them that authority to execute judgment and punishment. And that's exactly what Paul talks about in the book of Romans, that chapter 13, that governments exercise discipline and correction, that they have the sword and they have it for a reason, and God gives them the okay to do that. And so we have to understand that, when we talk about thou shalt not kill, we already begin to question if that's something that is meant to apply across the board in every single circumstance, because, even just a cursory looking at this situation, and we can see that there are some scenarios where it's okay. So as Christians, as you and I, not as police officers in line of duty, not as soldiers fighting for our country, are we allowed to use that kind of force? Are we allowed to use deadly force or lethal force in defending ourselves? A lot of what I'm going to do tonight is going to involve looking at the Old Testament. I know that Israel, 3,000 plus years ago is not the same as America today, but I think we got to compare apples to apples. We're both talking about governments. We're both talking about some parallels with the old law and the new law. Again, they are not exactly the same, but I think we can make some conclusions. And this is something that when we look at Israel, there are distinctions. Israel did not have a standing police force. That is something that differs from them and us today. And so there are some things that don't quite apply, but even in looking at those examples, we learn that there are differences, that killing is not always the same, that not all types of taking a life are equal. Because in the law of Moses, without a standing police force or professional army from the time of Moses through the time of Saul, God allowed a limited and restricted amount of personal vengeance. You'd say vigilante style. I think the biblical phrase in the Old Testament is avenger of blood. And that was one of God's ways of keeping things in order, keeping things in check. But again, that's not quite the same today. We don't confuse this with self-defense. Though that is examples in the Bible, that's not self-defense. I think we can tell the difference. You know, it's one thing to discover the body of a slain loved one and pick up your hunting rifle and go looking for the killer, versus a situation, a legitimate self-defense situation where fear is your motivating factor for your safety or your loved one's safety. So not all situations in the Bible compare perfectly today, but I think the point is that both God's law and our civil government, they condone a kind of stopgap justice. They condone this type of, self-defense. It's not all the same thing. So when we consider lethal force in the Bible, I just thought that was funny. If anyone asks you, what would Jesus do? Remind him that flipping over tables and chasing people with a whip is within the realm of possibilities. We certainly do need to consider the examples of the Bible. In the Old Testament, not all killing is condemned. Again, this is my biggest struggle with trying to apply thou shalt not kill to self-defense situations. I don't think that's the intent of that law in the Old Testament, and I don't think that's the intent of what Jesus taught in the New Testament either. In Exodus chapter 22, if you'll turn over there, you find that there are some situations where the taking of a life is acceptable. Exodus chapter 22, verse 2, it says, "If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account." And so this, gives certain situations. In the Ten Commandments, in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13, I believe it's the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder. Well, this isn't saying, you don't have to obey the Ten Commandments. This is saying there's a difference between murder and incidental killing in self-defense. This is saying that if in the middle of the night, and I think that adds a little bit of mystery to the situation. That adds a little bit of unknown. You don't know what's happening. Someone's breaking into your house, and it says if you, in self-defense, strike the person, they happen to die, doesn't make you guilty of violating the sixth commandment. It means you are defending yourself, and in a situation where you don't know the outcome, you don't know exactly what's happening, you don't know the intent of the other person, you lashed out, and they became a victim of it. It says you didn't do anything wrong in that situation. A roof cave in, the law talks about if you build a house and the roof caves in because of your neglect, you could be executed for that. There's difference. If through your negligence somebody dies, you're guilty of their death, and you'll be punished for it. Yet, if they're breaking into your home, you're not guilty if you take their life. So, not all killing is the same. To kill in self-defense carried no guilt under God's application of thou shalt not kill. And so we need to understand that there's a distinction here. And even when we go to the original language in Hebrew and in Greek, there's a distinction between killing and murder. I'm not even going to bother to pronounce these words, but the Hebrew word used, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13, and in my Bible, it actually says, you shall not murder. That's a specific word, and it comes from the Hebrew word there, and it's a term for murder as opposed to accidental death, death in war, death on the battlefield. You're not guilty of murder if you are fighting for your country and kill someone of the enemy side. That's not necessarily murder in the sense that it's intended in the Ten Commandments. That is an intentional taking of somebody's life. That is with a malicious intent. And this distinction is more closely seen, especially when we look at the New Testament, but God commanded God commanded the execution of certain criminals. There were a lot of crimes in the Old Testament, including murder, rape, negligent contractors or builders, unyielding children. God said the punishment for those types of sins was to put them to death. Is God telling Israel to violate the sixth commandment? Or is God saying that punishment for a crime is not the same as murder? Murder is a premeditated killing or taking of life with a malicious intent. Distributing justice or executing justice is not the same thing. Self-defense is not the same thing. Taking a life on the battlefield is not the same thing as God forbid in the Ten Commandments there. And so there's a distinction, and the same distinction is noted even when we look to the New Testament. Jesus chose an equally distinctive word, and again, I'm not going to bother pronouncing the Greek word, but there it is. And according to some of the foremost Greek texts, Strong's defines this word to be a murderer. According to Thayer, it means to commit murder. And according to Vines, it says to murder, akin to the other Greek word, a murderer. So, when Jesus in Matthew 5, and let's look at Matthew 5 and verse 21, Jesus is quoting the Old Testament here. So whether it's Hebrew or Greek, I think it's important to notice that there's a distinction here. Matthew 5 and verse 21, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. Again, Jesus is using a word that is translated correctly here as murder. It's not a blanket statement against all taking of life. That's not what I see going on here. So Jesus is not condemning the taking of a life in self-defense. He's not necessarily a proponent of it in that verse either, I want to point out. The taking of a life is something that we shouldn't take lightly. So that's where I struggle with this question is, I don't see the Bible condemning it, blanket, all across the board, one simple rule that you should never kill under any circumstance. But also, equally and opposite, I have a hard time finding support in the Bible that encourages us to do so. That's why I say I'm going to leave this one up to you and your conscience, what you understand the Bible, what you're willing and comfortable to do. Because, I just want to make it clear, I don't think the Bible condemns taking of a life. And there are other occasions as well. One of the classic verses people look to, in Luke chapter 22, and again, there's all kinds of back and forth on this from either side of this debate, whether you should or shouldn't use lethal force or violent force to resist or in self-defense. In Luke 22, Jesus gives a simple instruction. Luke 22, verse 36. He said to them, but now let him who has a purse take it along, likewise also a bag, and let him who has no sword sell his robe and buy one. And they say in verse 38, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. So Jesus encourages them to buy swords. I don't know what other reason you have a sword for, but for self-defense or, for fending off an attack. But nonetheless, that's a statement that is, a lot of people have twisted one way or another, but I'll let you think about that one. In the confrontation that ensued where Peter cut off the ear of the servant, Jesus doesn't necessarily condemn the use of the sword. He doesn't revile the disciples for having it with them because he commanded them to have it. He told them to have swords. He does say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword, but that's not necessarily a condemnation in a sinful sense. It's just a simple statement of truth. I'll talk about that statement a little bit more later, but I'll also point out that a lot of people like to say, on the one hand, Jesus told them to buy swords, so he's saying it's okay to have weapons to defend yourself, but on the other hand, Jesus told Peter to put his sword away, and Jesus didn't have the disciples defend him. I'll just point out, if you look at scriptures like Matthew 26 and verse 56, Matthew 26, verse 56, there's a reason why Jesus didn't defend himself. There were other occasions where Jesus protected his life. non-violently it seems, but there's a very big reason why Jesus did not defend himself or have his disciples defend him, because it was his time to go. It was his time to be offered up. Matthew 26 and verse 56, but all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. He said, put your swords away, I'm going with them. And when you put all the accounts together, when you mesh the narratives, it really is an incredible story to picture in your mind's eye, that at one point they bow before Jesus, I think against their will. And that's Jesus saying, you see, if I don't want you to take me, I'm not going with you. But I'm going with you because it's my time. And that I think needs to be stated as well, that there's a reason why they didn't defend Jesus, because it was his time. So here's just some of the basics in studying and examining this question for myself. When you look at the Old Testament and the New, you realize there is a distinction, that there are some areas where we just accept that killing is not the same as murder. On the battlefield, the government executing justice or punishment, and I believe in self-defense. The Old Testament especially says self-defense is acceptable. That if you take a life in an act of self-defense, it's not the same as committing murder, according to the Ten Commandments. And I believe that distinction is still there in the New Testament. I don't think there's anything that plainly condemns self-defense. And of course, there's a few examples. And Paul talks about fighting off wild beasts in Ephesus, and, is he talking about literal animals, or is he just using figurative language to describe wicked people? I don't know. There's a lot of stuff in there that people take and I think kind of run with it a little too far. Here's just some of the basics. I want you to think about this, and this is something we need to come to our own conclusions on and decide how we feel about this. But again, there it is. When I look at the Bible, I see a distinction between killing and murder. Not all killing is the same. The Bible isn't necessarily telling us we should kill people, but it's telling us we shouldn't, in a premeditated sense, murder somebody. That is wrong. No question about that. But I would like to say this. There's a few things we need to remember. Though I think that self-defense is permitted, I think it is something that is acceptable. And, again, there's a lot of scriptures that don't deal directly with this question. A lot of people look at, Ephesians chapter 5 that talks about the husband and wife relationship, that the husband protects and nourishes, his family, just like, somebody would protect and nourish their own flesh. And a lot of people look at that and say, well, that means he would protect it against intruders. And I think there's some merit to that thought, but it doesn't directly talk about it. But there are some principles I think we ought to remember. Violence should not come naturally to the Christian. In Luke chapter 9, though I think it is permissible in situations where you are protecting your family, that's my belief on this matter. I'll go ahead and on record and say it. I think the Christian is permitted to use force, potentially even lethal force, to protect his or her family or their life. But in Luke chapter 9, I just want to remind you a few principles. Violence should not come naturally to the Christian. In Luke chapter 9, we get this interesting story where Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he's passing through Samaria, and it says in verse 51, it came about when the days were approaching for his ascension that he resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead of him. They went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him, and they did not receive him because he was journeying with his face toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them and said, you do not know what kind of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to a different village, it says. Now, there was not necessarily a threat of violence against Jesus in the situation, but the way Jesus rebuked him, it tells me that this shouldn't be the first thing that we jump to, that violence shouldn't be, our natural tendency. It shouldn't come naturally to us. We should shy away from violence. Now, is it acceptable in certain situations? I believe so, but it shouldn't be our default setting. Our default setting should be seeking for peace. And that's what Romans 12 and verse 18 says. As much as it depends on us, as much as we can do to maintain peace, we do it. Now, I like that Paul in Romans 12, he leaves a little room for that truth that not everybody's going to have peace. So as much as depends on you, be at peace with others, with everybody. And, in Matthew 5, this is another scripture that's often used as evidence that a Christian should be pacifist, but I don't think that's the teaching here. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38. Jesus is not teaching against self-defense, he's teaching against retaliation. That's what I see him teaching on here. Matthew 5 and verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And again, there's all kinds of discussion on trying to interpret what this all means. They say if someone hits you on your right cheek, well, if somebody's right-handed, they're going to hit you on your left cheek unless they're giving you the back of their hand. This is more of an insult. That's what a lot of people believe is being described here, is an insult. If somebody's insulting you, somebody is bullying you, well, that doesn't mean you fight him back. It means you take it and you move on. You understand they have a sad life, and you don't let them get to you, but you don't respond with violence. You don't respond evil for evil. That's retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They hit you, so you hit them back. This isn't exactly self-defense being described here. This is talking about retaliating for an offense. But again, this should be our default setting, not escalating a situation. Not escalating a situation. We should not retaliate. In Luke chapter 6, a parallel account, the thoughts leading up to the same thing over there. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 27, it says, but I say to you, you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. What I'm talking about is situations, and we could throw Proverbs 15 and verse 1 in this scenario as well, that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, I know that I've encountered some Christians that say someone breaks into their house and starts robbing them and starts attacking their wife or their children. I can't use violence, so I'll try to reason with them. Good luck with that. You're not going to get through to them. I'm sorry. Some people are beyond rational thought. That's not what I'm suggesting here. A gentle answer turns away wrath. What I'm saying is sometimes we create situations, we provoke, we retaliate, we escalate a bad situation to where it becomes violent, to where we're now in the situation where we feel endangered and we respond in self-defense. But maybe we got the situation that far because we retaliated, we responded in kind. Just remember, a gentle answer turns away wrath. When that is applicable, that should be our default setting. Not escalating a situation, not making it worse, not throwing fires on the flame, not retaliating. Take an insult. Take it, don't respond, don't make it worse. If we can avoid a situation where we feel endangered or our family feels endangered, that's better. That's better than taking a life. That's better than responding with violence. And we need to ultimately remember the example that Jesus left for us. Let's go back to Matthew 26 for a moment. Just want you to reflect on these words. Matthew 26 and verse 56. Verse 52. Matthew 26, verse 52. Again, I hope you've understood what I've said in my first half of this lesson. I believe that not all killing is equal. I believe that in situations of peril, I think a Christian, has the leeway to defend themselves and defend their families. But also, I feel very strongly that we should seek for peace. We should be willing to turn the other cheek when we can in hopes of avoiding a violent situation. We should definitely avoid retaliation, which is exactly what Jesus taught us. But also we need to remember, violence is just not supposed to be characteristic of a Christian. Matthew 26 and verse 52, Jesus said, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Now, other translations say those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And I think this is a general statement of truth. This is not a condemnation of all self-defense per se, but it's a general truth. That if we act in violence, violence will find its way to us. And so this is just not a way to live. Violence is not a way to live. And so we shouldn't live by the sword. We shouldn't be eager to take up the sword. I believe it's a last defense. I don't know. It's one of those situations. Like I said, it's one thing to talk about what you do in a home invasion situation, a mugging, a robbery situation. It's one thing to say what you do, but I think in the moment, we might all be surprised with what actually happens. I doubt it would go how we plan. But I do know that we shouldn't be eager to take up a weapon. We shouldn't be eager to take a life. And I think that's what Jesus is telling us here. In Luke 23 and verse 34, Luke 23, verse 34, when you remember the attitude that Jesus had. Again, this isn't saying that a lot of people look at this and say all self-defense is wrong. That's not what's being taught here. But it is telling us that what should characterize us is not violence, but forgiveness, mercy. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That's the example Jesus left for us. And we're told in 1 Peter chapter 2, basically recapping the crucifixion, that's the example. That's the standard for the Christian. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." Christians in history have died because of their faith. And I think that's bravery, to face death for your faith, for your God. We don't necessarily face that right now, but that's happened to Christians in the past, and it may happen to us again. It's probably happening in other parts of the world right now. It's one thing to entrust yourself to God, and that's really what we need to do. We might not be strong enough to defend ourselves or our families. I think the Christian has permission, if you will. I think the Christian is permitted to defend his or her family or his life. But we need to accept the fact we might not be strong enough to do so. We might not be prepared enough to do so. And that's why we ultimately need to put our trust in God and follow the example of Jesus, who so bravely faced his own mortality. So I hope I've given you something to think about. Again, on Sunday nights, we don't always do a standard gospel sermon. We like to discuss some of these fringe topics, so to speak, but they're pertinent with all the violence that's going on in the world and even in our own country. These are situations we feel like we're more and more likely to face, sadly. And we ought to be thinking about this. We ought to be prepared. Am I willing to let somebody do violence to another because I don't want to take up a sword, because I don't want to harm them? Or am I willing to take a life? Am I willing to defend my life or defend the life of somebody else? Those are questions I think are fair to ask and something we ought to think about because, well, we never know in those situations we're going to face them. But ultimately, I hope we learn to trust our lives to Jesus, trust our lives to God, know that he will judge everything perfectly. He will get things right in the final assessment. and what awaits us after this life, beautiful, perfect, wonderful. We can endure anything this world has to throw at us. I want to end on that positive note. I know this hasn't been a gospel sermon, but if you've heard anything in the Bible this evening that has pierced your heart, that has convicted your conscience, if your desire is to be baptized into Christ and confess your sins and be clothed with Christ in baptism, or if you are a Christian here tonight and you need prayers or encouragement, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.